I'll talk briefly about messaging, and to start with something called fundamental messaging. But before going into that, I want to talk to you about a few different things that we often come across. So very often we meet companies where the messaging is created individually by marketing, individually by sales, and very ad hoc by delivery and product. But looking at the whole thing, these departments are talking different languages to the client. So a consequence is often that marketing is talking about A in their campaigns. Sales is coming in saying, yeah, marketing, they don't really understand this, so it's not really like what you saw in the marketing, this is how it is. And then when sales has concluded the deal, delivery comes in and say, well, it's not like, salespeople, they talk a lot, it's not like that. So it's really like this. And then when you meet product, they give you a fourth story. That is not instilling any trust in your buyer. And trust is a key pillar in doing large deals and mega deals. Another common consequence of not having a synced messaging architecture across the company is that vendors are talking too much about themselves. They're talking too much about their products and services, and they talk too little about the clients. And I'll soon show you a model for this. What the kind of good companies are doing, but also what the stars are doing. Another thing that we find with companies is that since there is no messaging architecture designed and created and worked through, marketing often is creating content in a very ad hoc way. They go, I have this idea, let's do this film, or I have this idea, let's do this article. What we try to help our clients with is to create a systematic, industrialized approach that you can repeat and scale. And where marketing, sales, product, delivery, they're all synced. You will have zero or very close to zero debates internally whether we should talk about A, B, or C, it's synced. So you'll be way more scalable, way more profitable, way more professional. A fourth very common issue in most companies is that we try to industrialize only top of the funnel. So we're talking about maybe the customer, maybe the problems we can solve, maybe how we can solve them, but we're staying top of the funnel. And that is sometimes systematically created, whereas bottom of the funnel and with existing clients is created ad hoc. And if you do a time study, especially on sales, you realize that they spend a lot of time cutting and pasting pieces of material to answer customer questions. If you have a messaging architecture worked through with the fundamental messaging, taking the customer from a question mark to wanting to buy, the deal closing messaging, taking them from a wanting to buy to actually buying, and then orientational messaging that is bringing the audience, a large audience inside your account and in the ecosystem, then this will be able to be systematically created. You will have a more scalable company and you will make more money. I will quickly show you now the first of the three pieces of the messaging architecture, which is called fundamental messaging, how we take the customer from unaware to wanting to buy. And here customers are typically talking, as I mentioned, too much about themselves. The slightly better companies are talking about what we call the change drivers. So what are the reasons for needing to change, thus leading to buying? But the stars are doing something more than that. We will have a look at that now. Messaging is probably the part of the discipline that requires the most work, the highest intelligence, and a bit of patience. It consists of three parts. First of all, how do you move the customer from unaware to actually wanting to buy? We call that fundamental messaging. The next step is how do you take the customer from wanting to buy, and all the people listening to this that are fairly senior know that just because they want to buy doesn't mean they buy. And in larger deals, the majority of the work happens from when they want to buy to the actual buying. So the next phase we call deal closing messages, and it takes them from wanting to buy to actually signing. And then there's the third type of messaging. We call it orientational messaging. And it's a way to increase the audience inside your target accounts because you increase the size of your topic. So instead of talking about your product, you talk about a much larger topic where your product is playing a part. Sometimes we use the analogy of placing an Aston Martin car in a James Bond movie. So instead of talking about the Aston Martin car, we're talking about the James Bond movie. So out of the three parts of the messaging architecture, fundamental messaging is the first one and probably the most important. So here, a lot of companies that we engage with are talking too much about themselves. The slightly better ones are talking about the change drivers behind a decision. So what are the pains, gains, macro trends, etc. that are leading to a need for change? So the slightly better companies are doing these two. The stars are doing two more things. They're realizing that a big decision doesn't happen from a problem to one particular vendor. They realize that there are a few layers in between. First of all, the customer or the prospective customer, they need to figure out, okay, I have this issue, I have this set of problems. What are the viable type of solutions in the market that can solve this, including internal options? So what are the different types of categories of solutions that can solve my set of problems and reach the kind of gains I'm after? So instead of leaving these, we're actually talking about this. We're describing, let's say it's 5 different categories that can solve the problems the customer is having. Instead of just talking about ours, we actually talk about all 5, the category choices, the definition of each, the pros and the cons of each, and the consequence of going down that path for this particular client or this particular segment. But beyond that, let's say then the customer is saying, okay, we really want to go down this path. We think that category X is for us. Then instead of jumping straight into why us, why this vendor, we're actually creating a set of subcategories. This can either be different subcategories, or in many cases we create dimensions. So to choose a solution in this category, we need to look at these 5 dimensions. Could be hosted or SaaS, could be high security, low security, could be high temperature, low temperature, depends on what you're selling. But you're trying to, for the client, and actually help them with their decision tree, you categorize the subcategories as well. Again, similar to this, which are they? What are the definitions of each? What are the pros and cons and consequences of each? So then you have a very intellectual discussion with the client where they see you as a thought leader, as an advisor, and you should actually think as an advisor here. That increases the trust in your customer dialogue. And if you do this right, they'll actually make this their decision material. So if you've described the various choices in a very nuanced and neutral way, they will use this. I've seen this so many times. And then you come to what probably most of you are great at, to talk about why you as a company, your products, features, benefits, unique selling points, etc. But here, again, to emphasize, what most companies actually, apart from the superstars, are missing is to talk about the category choices and the subcategory choices. A few great things to mention around messaging architecture, and in particular the fundamental messaging, is that the first 3 layers here, change drivers, category choices, subcategory choices, if you've done this right, you can use it as a keynote speech at any conference because you're talking about the industry. You're fleshing out the various choices in the industry. So you can basically take that material straight off. As soon as you cut out yourself, your company, that will be seen as a very insightful keynote speech. Another thing to mention around the fundamental messaging is that we, in our longer programs, are teaching our clients to use this to detect where the client is. I mean, if you're in a meeting number 3, you can probably just swish through the first few layers and go deeper into the bottom. But if you're in an early stage, you go more on the top here, you're heavier on the top, fleshing out, creating a dialogue around the change drive, not just mentioning what you've seen in their industry, but you're also really opening up for that discussion and spend a lot of time on it. So you could see, like, depending on where they are, there's a lot of time spent here, or here, or here, but you're kind of covering all the time. What also often happens is that there's a 4th or 5th or 51st contact coming into the process, and they might be up here, whereas the people you've spoken to most are down here. So this is very often used as a way to detect where should I put the emphasis in this particular dialogue, both for marketing and for sales? Something that David mentioned earlier, which is a key trait among megadealers, which is to disqualify cases early. If you've done the fundamental messaging right, meaning you've created a decision tree for the client, you can actually disqualify them in the meeting. So you're going through the various choices because you've described each choice. You've talked about the pros and cons and the consequences. First of all, you get feedback from them because they do give you feedback on how you've described the various choices and what you've missed maybe. But you will also figure out that maybe on the category or the subcategory level is actually better for them to go another direction. And the best mega dealers, what they do here is that they leave the discussion. They're not banging their head against the wall, trying to win, even though the odds are awful. The best mega dealers spend time on cases that there is a higher likelihood of winning, which is contradictory to what we've learned in sports and other areas where we should really fight. We should fight here as well, but we should really be smart about where we fight. It's important to pick your fights. So to use the messaging architecture and the fundamental messaging, which is this first third of it, is a great way to disqualify early. Something else that we teach our clients in our longer sessions and our longer programs is that we teach them how to create different lengths of this. So this fundamental messaging can be described in an hour, in 15 minutes, 3 minutes, or maybe even 1 minute. So depending on which context you're in, you're also flexing the length. We're helping our clients to create the different length pitch video that you might have on your website that is catching the early interest. It might be a 3-minute version max of all these 4 layers, but really fast. If you're at the conference having a keynote speech, these 3 layers might cover 30 minutes or 40 minutes. And in meeting number 7 with a client, these might be taking, especially the bottom, might be taking several hours. So we're helping our clients to design the different length based on the messaging architecture. The second messaging type is deal closing messaging, when we move the client from wanting to buy to actually buying. And this journey is the longest. A lot of companies are spending a lot of time on getting the attention from the client, but they have underinvested in the deal closing process, both for the salespeople and for the marketing people. We have content for top of the funnel, very little for the deal closing. So in the deal closing messaging phase, we're covering things like how do things work, but also how do I go from what has to happen between wanting to buy and buying? What happens from signing to going live? And how is the ongoing relationship between the vendor and the customer looking like? These things are covered intensively by the buyers. They ask these questions until they have the answers. They're not putting a large sum of money on the table before these questions are answered. And most companies have salespeople cutting and pasting answers to this on an ongoing basis. So if you do a time study, a lot of time is spent on actually doing this type of work, which is a bit ineffective. What you also cover in the deal closing is risk mitigation. Both risk mitigation workshop, but also content that is risk mitigating. Reference cases, analyst comments, PR is also risk mitigating. But you also focus on how do we drive consensus in the buying community. So some of the messaging we have to develop has to be very extracted, very condensed, like short versions. That's why we often recommend to do pitch videos where we cover the fundamental messaging and actually some risk mitigation in a 3-minute video. The third type of messaging is called orientational messaging. The purpose of orientational messaging is to broaden the audience inside the target account and in the ecosystem around the deal. The way to do that is to talk about bigger topics. So if we're the Aston Martin car, that's what we want to sell. We're not talking about the Aston Martin car, we're talking about the Bond movie. So all of a sudden we're talking about bigger topics than we actually sell. So if we want to do something in renewable energy for the maritime sector, we're talking about the 5 big renewable energy trends, and we might be a part of one of them. But we're making a bigger topic. Or if we take Megadeals, for example, that was actually created in the beginning as a way to get a larger audience inside the biggest companies in the world when we were selling account-based marketing, which was a subset, or the Aston Martin car, of Megadeals, which was the Bond movie. So all of a sudden, instead of having 5 people in the room talking account-based marketing, we had 50 people in the room talking Megadeals. And he was part of the top management teams, the industry leaders, the mega dealers, the marketing leaders, etc. It's a great audience because the topic was bigger. And if you do this right, you will increase the size of the audience inside your target account, and that will enable you to drive consensus at scale together with the various distribution tactics that we've covered earlier. To summarize it, you're using fundamental messaging to bring the customer from unaware to wanting to buy from you. And you use the deal closing messaging to move from wanting to buy to actually buying. You use the orientational messaging to increase the audience and gain the consensus in the ecosystem around the deal. Once you've set this, using people from marketing, PR, sales, delivery, and product, which makes it synchronize across the company, you amplify it in videos, articles, posts, in sales meetings, enterprise social selling, ads, webinars, PR, etc. So one consequence of having the messaging architecture set up is that you no longer will have fights internally on what to write and say, when, and where. A lot of companies, again, are putting their branding in place and their culture and attitudes and values, but they're not putting the messaging architecture in place. One thing that we have created together with our clients is a big matrix in Excel where you have fundamental messaging, deal closing messaging, orientational messaging worked through in the different length and the different buying phases. To map this with content, both sales meeting content, but also marketing content and social media content, we've created this template that is very, very liked by our clients. We're not going through that today, but that's really high value. It creates an opportunity for our clients to be more systematic and industrialized in how they approach marketing and sales, even for larger deals.